Hi, I'm Ali Patterson. On this episode of Fintech Finance, we're taking a closer look at getting prepared for GDPR. For this, we speak with Midshore Consulting, AIB, ING, and with RBS. Firstly, we spoke with Christopher Jehan from Midshore Consulting to figure out exactly what GDPR means for the banking industry.
Firstly, you've got to remember the original data protection directive that came out from the European Union was written when the internet was in its infancy. Now we're looking at a lot more information that people are entering online, a lot more information being held in a lot more places. So what we're now looking at is putting an increased standard for data protection in place. The work that's involved is going to be quite onerous, but to be honest, financial services institutions compared to, for example, doctors' practices, a doctor's practice will need to have much tighter controls in place because of the sensitive data they're holding. Most financial services companies won't have that level of sensitive data. I mean, we've got to remember that in data protection terms, people's account balances are not classed as sensitive data, they're just data. It's people's names, addresses, telephone numbers, it's their medical history, so on. That's personal data, not your account balance. So realistically, the impact on the financial services industry is not going to be as great as the impact on certain other industries out there. However, of course, more regulation means more time being spent, greater controls being put in place, more information security, greater degree of information assurance. Again, a whole new project will have to come about in every company. A lot of places will be putting in place specific data protection officers. Now, in the past, the role of compliance officer and the role of data protection officer within a financial institution have often been the same person. Now, yes, to be a data protection officer, you do need to understand the regulation, but you also need to understand the type of media that the information is being stored on, what the safeguards are, what the information security is. So actually a data protection officer needs to have a whole additional layer of skills, more geared towards the technology side, alongside the regulatory side. So I can see there being, in the same way that around 1986, 1987, the role of compliance officer really came into its own. I can see the role of data protection officer is really going to come into its own going forward. And from next year, I think data protection officer will become a more highly paid speciality.
Do you think that in terms of protecting the data, it's not just the bank themselves, they then have to sort of protect against external threats?
Yes, absolutely. And the level of fines is going to go up significantly. So it's going to be more important for any company to put safeguards in place around the data. And you just mentioned a retailer there. So certainly, I mean, within Guernsey, we formed an association of data protection officers, and initially we're seeing a lot of engagement from the accounting firms, the law firms, the financial services firms, and the technology firms. We need to look to engage with the retail sector, the online gambling sector. We need to look to engage with the doctor's surgeries, the dental practices. It's less about financial services, it's about everyone now. But of course, yes, the banks, the asset managers will need to put in place greater safeguards around their security and try to make sure that people can't access their clients' data online. And so, yes, the whole issue of cyber security is going to become much more important.
We went to speak with Fergal Coburn to hear about some of the challenges that AIB face when it comes to using the data that they've acquired.
So obviously from a data protection point of view, it's the consumer's permission is required. So we know that GDPR coming in next year is going to provide great structure and regime and really empower the consumer in that data. So fundamentally, in the hotel example I gave you, that's anonymized data. So there's no customer, there's no personally identifiable customer in that information. That's analysis, that's analytics running on top of anonymized data to give really powerful messaging to support business in driving their business. So GDPR obviously will put great structure and regime, and there's significant work for banks to do to comply with all the requirements of GDPR, but it's going to be back into the hands of the consumer to give us permission on the data that we need. So,
is it going to be a positive thing for both you and the consumer?
So I think when we look at, coming from the digital payments perspective in AIB, I look at PSD2 and GDPR through the one lens. There's great overlaps and cross. So obviously with PSD2, we're opening up the bank's payments and account information services to third parties with the permission of the consumer. and we look at GDPR and the overlap of that, the types of information we're sharing, the controls and obligations we have to the consumer for protecting their data, and we look at how there's very aggressive dates for these, so PSD2 January next year, GDPR May next year. It's a very tight timeline for us to comply. So I talk to a lot of peer banks who are very focused on the comply-only space. So because of the work involved and the legacy infrastructure that has to be brought to compliance, so that's obviously a primary focus for AIB. But we're also taking the time now, with some of the analytics use cases I've spoken to you about, to explore the opportunities that it presents. So I suppose you're going to have two cohorts of banks. The cohorts of banks who are firmly in the comply-only space, potentially becoming commodity providers of banking services, and then the banks who play in both spaces but see great opportunity in the value add that both GDPR gives with the consumer's permission and the PSD2 technically enables across the industry.
At ING we have a very deliberate strategy also in our internal private cloud to basically separate systems from each other to such an extent that if somebody inadvertently manages to bypass all our security in one area of the bank, and we know from situations where parties are hacked that it can happen through silly things like the camera system or the Wi-Fi system for guests or whatever, that that could never spill over into other parts of the system because that's completely compartmentalized. But what we also see is that, of course, things like PSD2, where we're unbundling in the value chain, where parts can basically be brought together by third parties to have a new bundle of services, also creates less control of one party over the total chain. And that's the whole point of PSD2, of breaking up that value chain. But it also means that there's less control over that chain. But not one party can guarantee throughout the whole chain that things will always run. I'm not only talking about security breaches, I'm also talking about denial of service attacks, etc. And funnily, one of my colleagues that I talked to said that even though that bank, it was another bank, is not very active on Bitcoin, that they had a huge demand for Bitcoin from their corporate customers, and the number one use case for that was actually paying for ransomware. So we see a lot of this happening in the last few days, and maybe it's because it's not a CIO conference here that the suppliers of solutions for this are not as present here, and we have more the innovative guys who come up with the new solutions, that the topic isn't quite as prominent here. But I think that cybersecurity is something that we need to keep investing in just as much as in better solutions for our customers, because they expect us to really take care of their security as well.
Your technology is only really as good as it's set up and the people using it. How do you enable banks to maximise the potential in their people when it comes to training and to competence?
Okay, so I think the main thing is to consider that it's people, the way they use technology in work as well as outside of work. So the general practices that they would use at home, say we were talking about the third-party USB policy before, the way they might use something, they might bring a device in. If they're trained to use the device correctly in the workplace, it generally goes home with them as well. As they generally use new technology that comes out, they'll become more competent in the way they're using it when they come back to the office environment.
When it comes to actually the sort of setup of various sort of new platforms, what sort of approach do you think an organisation should take? Where do you sort of strike that balance between being flexible enough for future solutions, but at the same time looking at the actual costs?
So in terms of actually building an application that supports what you're doing, I think it should be quite restrictive in the way that a user is able to use it. So they only should have access to the parts that they're trained to use. If they haven't received the training, they shouldn't be able to see it. It's part of the restriction, basically stopping something happening before it's enabled to happen. So you don't want the IT system to be the enabler for the person that's using it.
What sort of role do people play in that in terms of being the weak link in the chain?
So generally this could go back to the big data market. An individual, again, might give their details away for use of an app. They might happen to do that on a system or give away some of their personal information, which could enable a cyber criminal to perhaps take up their identity or even give them access to what their passwords or something like that might be. So in respect to that, it's quite a big, I think it's an important thing. They need the full training on it to understand it in both environments.
I also caught up with Richard Crook from RBS to hear his take on how to utilise the data and how this fits in with regulation.
So you're absolutely right, it's regulation season, but we actually prefer the term, the tsunami of regulation that came through has already passed. regulation is part of the banking industry. It is one of the most regulated industries in the world, and we would expect to see regulation. Regulation is an opportunity if you're in an innovation space, because it requires you to implement it, and when you implement it, it gives you an opportunity to rethink and redo some of the old and give you an opportunity to tear it up and change it. And for an innovation perspective, that gives us an opportunity to use new technology to improve the customer's services improvements where you may not have had the cost or benefits case that you would have had if it wasn't there.
So just to expand on that, to take GDPR for example, being able to organise all that data in a more effective way, what are some of the opportunities around that?
So GDPR is an opportunity because, as I said, innovation looks for those regulations to rethink and redo on certain areas, and data and looking after customers' data is extremely important to us. We have always held the safety of our customers' data paramount, and to that end, GDPR adds to that and adds a regulatory requirement to it, which we're very pleased to be implementing.
With all that data then being able to be organised in such a way and forced to be organised, does that then lead to quite a large opportunity for delivering a more enhanced customer experience because you understand your customers more?
I think both the reorganisation of that data because of the regulation coming through gives an opportunity to surface that data to our customers and provide them insight back that they may not already know about themselves. And also the opportunity, as you point out, to give the customer a greater understanding of the data that we hold.
We went to hear from Eric Tack from ING to get his take on GDPR.
Well, I think it will certainly, and I think that in certain areas we even still detect some areas where GDPR seems to be contradicting PSD2 even. The good thing about GDPR is it creates clarity and a level playing field for everyone in the market, what you can and what you cannot do, and for what you need what kind of consent from the owner of the data or to do that. But to give you an example, when we have account information services in PSD2, we have to basically make sure that we give all the relevant data to the third party if the account holder requests that. But under the GDPR, data like the account number of the other parties of whom the payments are there should be filtered out because they haven't given consent to share their data with third parties. So that's where we need to find out how we can filter that out and how we can find a way around that. So I think in general, good that we finally have some clarity around this. It also creates a level playing field between all parties in the chain to do it, but I think there's still a lot of clarification needed. Also, for instance, there's a exemption in the GDPR that if we use data for fraud monitoring, for fraud detection, that there are certain waivers applicable. And we think that we need a lot of those data and to actually keep it safe because of the cybersecurity threats that I talked about earlier. But how exactly to apply for the waiver, how to make sure that you actually are allowed to do certain things, sometimes even without consumer consent, is something we still need to find out.
Furthermore, we were interested to hear about the course that is offered by Midshore Consulting.
Well, we've got to remember that when it comes to banking, people have options out there. Let's say there were no rules, no regulations, no legislation, no EU directives, nothing sat there. What it would come down to is reputation. And the bank would want the reputation of people's data being secure. The bank would want people to feel that their information is safe and is not going to be released publicly. So it would come down to, do we want to retain our customer base? If you want to retain your customer base, you put in place a good standard of practice. Certainly, speaking with one of my hats on as the chairman of the Association of Data Protection Officers in Guernsey, what we see the data protection legislation that we're bringing in to mirror GDPR into Guernsey's laws is actually, it'll become another, if you like, gold star. It'll become another standard that Guernsey is meeting, and it's going to become a reputational quality piece for the island, alongside our financial crime standing, our tax transparency standing, and something that we can hold up internationally and say, you should want to come to us because, amongst other things, we have a good standard of data protection. We will look after your data. As an island, we're committed to that. And we talk a lot to the Data Protection Commissioner, and we need to, speaking to her, she is passionate about data protection. And that, as a result, I'd like to see that ingrained more into people's way of thinking within the island. And I know very small 1-2 person internet businesses which will have to deal with data protection alongside the likes of hotels that don't have the budget that a big bank does. But when it comes to banking, they've got the money to spend on the program to put the information security in place to make sure that the data is secure. So why wouldn't they? Because that will increase confidence in their business. And if other places are not so good on that standing, it will draw more business into those that are.
So we've learned, I suppose, in the last 2 years, AIB has done a big investment into its data warehouse technology to make sure we have a complete data set. We collect more data at our customers. We've collected more data in the last 6 months than we've done in the previous 15 years. So really we have this rich data set of every touch point and interaction we have with our consumers. Payments, naturally, is the high frequency data type we get from that.
So how can people really sort of apply for these courses, and what sort of things do they get out of them?
Well, the first thing is the application of the courses can be done on our website, which is www.midshoreconsulting.com, and people can apply for both an online or a classroom training course there. What they get out of them will be a certification which says I have taken a course which provides me with the information needed to be a data protection officer. It's we're looking at a level which is broadly similar to what would be required for a compliance officer in the United Kingdom. So around a level 3 qualification, which would be the sort of qualifications that would be recognised by the financial services regulator. And again, the sort of subjects we're looking at will include the practical applications, what happens when you have a breach, the breach reporting process, but also, of course, the side who you need to engage with within your business to try to ensure that your business is compliant. Compliance is the key. The breach is what happens when things go horribly wrong. But we need to deal with all sides of things, and probably in just over a year's time, when the regulation is in play, everyone will be starting to talk about the first breach.
On the next episode of Fintech Finance, we're taking a look at secure messaging.